On a spring morning in 1986, an employee of the Transamerica Corporation in an office in Arizona experienced a terrible feeling of déjà vu. While talking with colleagues in the break room, she smelled a strange aroma. The woman could not say exactly where the smell was coming from, but it was familiar to her and caused anxiety because the last time she had encountered it was under very frightening circumstances. The company employee became lost in her thoughts when suddenly cries came from the hallway. Colleagues who were seriously frightened were asking to urgently call 911. Although the woman did not understand what had happened, fear overcame her. It turned out that the events in the hallway and her memories were more closely connected than she could have imagined. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. March 24th, 1986, began for 46-year-old Julia Williams as an ordinary Monday. After waking up, she had breakfast, got ready, and headed to the Transamerica Corporation office in Tempe, Arizona. Transamerica was engaged in financial and insurance business, and Julia worked as a deposit secretary in a small branch specializing in home and commercial real estate insurance. Only a few people worked in the office, but this did not bother the woman. At that time, she had been working there for about 2 months and had gotten along excellently with her colleagues. Julia had moved to Arizona after her divorce and now lived with her daughter Nancy and son-in-law Mike in Mesa. She had spent most of her life in California, where she had gotten married and raised 3 children. The last couple of years had been difficult for Julia, and only recently had she begun to find solid ground under her feet. Work and attending church in Phoenix had helped her feel better. At work, Julia took care of her usual tasks, left her things on the desk, and went to the small office kitchen where her colleagues had gathered. On Monday, everyone was a little slow to start working. In the office break room, people were discussing their weekends, in no hurry to get down to business. Several employees were standing around the water cooler. When Julia entered the room, she wished everyone a good morning and poured herself a glass of water. After a few sips, a strange expression appeared on her face. She felt that the water had an unusual taste, and her lips and tongue felt as if they had been burned by flame. Julia warned her colleagues not to drink the water from the cooler and headed to the restroom herself. Despite this warning, 2 employees took cups and poured themselves some water. After taking a couple of sips each, the guy named Glenn and the woman named Deborah quickly realized that Julia was not joking. The water tasted so strange that they spat it out. No one paid much attention to the unusual incident in the kitchen. The employees decided to simply call the company that delivered drinking water and complain about the problem. Immediately, putting the situation out of their minds, they went to their workstations, but soon noticed that Julia still had not returned from the restroom. Deciding to check if she was okay, 2 employees went to the restroom and found the woman lying unconscious in one of the stalls. She was not responding to anything, and it became clear that something serious had happened. Soon, a couple of paramedics arrived at the scene, but by the time Julia was taken to the hospital, she had already fallen into a coma. Initially, the doctors assumed that she had suffered a massive stroke, but after a more thorough study of the symptoms and clarification of the circumstances of what had happened that morning, their opinion changed. Particular attention was drawn to the strange taste of the water in the office cooler. The police who arrived at the scene confirmed the doctor's worst fears. The water in the cooler contained cyanide, which, when dissolved in liquid, becomes transparent. In dry form, it has no odor, but when mixed with water, it can emit a slight almond aroma. The 2 other employees who also drank the water were not harmed because they did not manage to swallow a sufficient amount of the toxin. However, Julia, unfortunately, was not so lucky. Cyanide is a chemical substance that blocks the body's ability to use oxygen at the cellular level. This leads to a person beginning to suffocate from within, even if they technically continue to breathe. Symptoms of cyanide poisoning may include chest pain, dizziness, nausea, vomiting, and breathing problems. There is an antidote that can help in case of poisoning, but its effectiveness depends on how quickly it is taken. Unfortunately, in Julia's case, she was taken to the hospital when catastrophic and irreversible brain damage had already begun as a result of cyanide poisoning. She remained in a coma for 2 days before her daughter made the decision to disconnect her mother from life support. But the story did not end there. It turned out that the cyanide poisoning was not accidental. Potassium cyanide, although a naturally occurring chemical substance, is usually not found in such quantities in office water coolers. The police discovered that the toxin was not only in the cooler, but also in other items in the office kitchen, including milk, cream, mugs, and the coffee pot. This ruled out suspicions against the water delivery company, since the source of contamination was present in different places. Analysis results showed that the amount of cyanide was enough to poison at least 150 people. This caused alarm and suspicion of intentional crime, and whoever was behind it seemed not to have thought about the number of victims. The memory of the infamous crimes involving Tylenol in Chicago was still fresh in the public mind when 7 people died as a result of poisoning products with this drug. Only 4 years had passed since the tragedy, and fears about product tampering had not yet been forgotten. Naturally, cyanide in a small branch of the corporation raised many questions. Who would want to poison the company's employees, and for what reason? Were all employees the targets, or had someone harbored a grudge against a specific person? And the answers to these questions, strangely enough, were helped by one of the office employees in Arizona, Diana Harry. Julia Williams was indeed one of the victims of the poisoning, so investigators considered the possibility that she might have been the intended target. However, it soon became clear that there was no evidence of this. The woman had no sworn enemies, and she led a quiet, calm life surrounded by family. In addition, she was a new employee in the office and got along well with everyone, which made the version unlikely. The possibility was also considered that all employees of the Transamerica Corporation could have become targets, but the police had received no other reports. The situation looked extremely confusing and unclear. Everything changed when detectives spoke with other employees of the branch. One of them, Diana Harry, told a disturbing story. Diana was 29 years old, and she had worked at Transamerica for about 2 years. The woman explained that on the morning of the crime, she was in the break room with other colleagues when she smelled a strange odor. At first, she could not understand where it was coming from, and this caused her concern. Harry was sure that she recognized this smell, and that the last time she had encountered it was under extremely unpleasant circumstances. 3 days before the incident at the office, on Friday, March 21st, Diana was relaxing at home after work and decided to drink a little whiskey to unwind. Pouring herself a glass of alcohol and taking a sip, she felt that something was wrong. The whiskey tasted disgusting and had an unpleasant smell. The woman immediately set the glass of alcohol aside and complained about the taste of the drink to her husband, 32-year-old Louis Harry Jr., who had just returned from work. Louis also tried the whiskey and immediately spat it out, just like the other employees who later tried the poisoned water from the cooler. Diana said that during the incident, she felt ill, became dizzy, started feeling nauseous, and could not breathe. Going outside to get some fresh air, she momentarily felt better, but when she returned to the house, she lost consciousness. Fortunately, her fainting spell was brief, but she spent the entire weekend in bed. Initially, the woman thought the cause was poor quality alcohol, but after the incident with Julia Williams at the office, she changed her mind. What worried Diana most was the smell she had sensed in the office. The water cooler, like the whiskey, emitted the aroma of bitter almonds, a characteristic sign of the presence of cyanide. The police confiscated the bottle of whiskey from Diana's home, and it turned out that it also contained potassium cyanide, but in a smaller amount than in the cooler. If Diana had drunk more that evening, she would probably have died. Thus, it turned out that someone had twice unsuccessfully tried to poison Diana Harry, but who and for what reason could have wished her death? The first attempt was made in her own home, which immediately caused detectives to suspect her husband, Louis Harry Jr. However, Diana was sure that her husband would never harm her. She claimed that she and Louis had met about 5 years earlier at a volleyball match and were still in love with each other, and that both of them were united by an active lifestyle. Louis's entire existence revolved around sports. He played tennis, volunteered as a referee for basketball games at the local church and youth clubs. Even his job was related to sports. Lewis worked as equipment manager in the physical education department at South Mountain Community College in Phoenix. Diana and Lewis had been married for 3 years, and during that time, they had never had serious problems. The woman did not believe that her husband was capable of a crime. In addition, her husband had also tried the poisoned whiskey. Why would he do that if he knew about the poison? Moreover, it was Lewis who insisted on checking the poor quality alcohol when Diana told him about the incident. She had thrown the bottle in the trash the day after she felt ill, but Lewis pulled it out and put it away because he had his own suspicions. Then, Diana made another shocking admission. The woman told the police that for the last several weeks, she and her husband had been receiving threats from one person. It had all started a couple of months earlier when Lewis, unknowingly, had gotten into an unpleasant situation. He had met and become friends with a woman named Verbania Wooten. Verbania told him about the terrible ordeal she had gone through with her ex-boyfriend, 43-year-old delivery driver named Roy Fitzpatrick. Verbania and Roy had dated for about 3 weeks, but that was enough time for her to realize that they were not right for each other. When the woman tried to end the relationship, Roy turned into a complete psycho. He began stalking her, attacked her several times, and threatened violence, unwilling to accept the breakup. And this had been going on for a long period of time. Lewis advised Verbania to take Roy to court and even offered to go with her if she was afraid to go alone. The woman hesitated at first, but then decided to follow her friend's advice. Everything went well for her. She obtained a court order of protection against her ex-boyfriend and was able to get rid of the harassment. However, this decision led to unpleasant consequences for Lewis and Diana. Roy was furious about the restraining order, and since he continued to watch Verbania, he quickly learned of Lewis's involvement and directed all his anger at him and Diana. Over the past month, the hairy couple had received 7 letters from Roy Fitzpatrick in the mail. Some of them were addressed to Diana and some to Lewis. All the messages were aggressive, full of insults, and contained threats. The last letter the couple received before the incident at the office was especially ominous. It said that Roy was not going to give Lewis 2 women at once, and that he would have to get rid of one of them or send Lewis himself to the other world. Diana told the detectives that the letter they received had frightened her and her husband so much that they decided to prepare for self-defense. Lewis bought her a 9mm pistol and took her to shooting practice so that she could protect herself in case of an attack. This gave them a sense of security because the couple believed that Roy would attack them openly, but they were wrong. When the detectives spoke with Lewis Harry Jr., he told the same story as Diana, and in confirmation of his words, he handed over all of Roy Fitzpatrick's threatening letters. The authorities also spoke with Verbania Wooten, who stated that her ex-boyfriend was definitely capable of such actions. Over the past 5 years, he had turned her life into hell, and there was no line he would not cross just to gain control over her. With each new piece of evidence against Roy, his position became increasingly shaky. When the police contacted Fitzpatrick and offered to talk, he initially refused, but a day later he called back and agreed to answer questions. Roy did not deny sending the threatening letters to Lewis and Diana, but he continued to claim that he was innocent and that he had his own story that he wanted to share. Fitzpatrick stated that he had a grudge against Lewis, not because of the restraining order, but because he was having an affair with his ex-girlfriend Verbania. One day, he had followed Lewis and learned that he was married. This angered Roy, and he began sending him threatening letters. However, the man claimed that he was not involved in the poisonings or the murder. To the detectives' surprise, Verbania confirmed that she and Harry Jr. had been in a romantic relationship, but she believed that Lewis and Diana were getting a divorce. The lovers had even become engaged and were simply waiting for the divorce process to be completed. This was completely new information for the police, since neither Diana nor Lewis had mentioned a divorce. However, there was another detail that made them reconsider the course of the investigation. Returning to the conversations with Roy, the detectives showed him the letters seized from the Harry couple. As mentioned earlier, Lewis and Diana had received a total of 7 letters, but only the first 4 messages were handwritten. The last 3, the most threatening ones, were typed on a typewriter. Roy admitted to writing the first 4 letters, but claimed he had nothing to do with the other 3. Of course, this caused confusion among the detectives, who no longer knew whom to believe. However, one thing they knew for sure: they needed real evidence, and soon an incredible opportunity arose that finally helped unravel this unusual case. The day after the poisoning at the corporation branch, on March 25, 1986, the police conducted a search. The search took place in another office that had no connection to the Transamerica branch. But as soon as the investigators entered, it became clear that the crime had been planned right there. In addition to traces of potassium cyanide, on the detective's shelf, they found several notebooks on the desk in which fragments of the last 3 letters sent to the Harry couple had been written. It looked as if someone had been practicing composing the text in draft form before typing it on a typewriter. However, the most important evidence was 2 crumpled sheets of paper thrown into the trash can. They were a receipt and an information bulletin from the company listing the rules for handling chemicals and the rules for their use in scientific purposes. The receipt contained an order for 450 grams of potassium cyanide, dated March 7th. That is, the poison had been purchased just a couple of weeks before the poisoning at the office. Although the receipt was signed with the name Charles Hawley, the police considered this name fictitious because of where the office was located and to whom it belonged. The office was located on the campus of South Mountain Community College and belonged to Louis Harry Jr. The investigators invited a handwriting expert to analyze the signature on the receipt and compare it with the signature of Diana's husband. The expert confirmed that the signature on the receipt belonged to Louis. The representative of the chemical company who handled the transaction not only recognized Louis from the photograph, but also stated that Harry Jr. had used the South Mountain Community College account to make the purchase. And this was easy to trace, since the college sometimes purchased various chemicals for laboratories, but potassium cyanide had never been stored on the campus grounds. Another incredible way the police linked Louis to the crime was the envelope used to send one of the typewritten threatening letters. The envelope had a manufacturing defect. When the investigators searched Louis's office, they found a box with exactly the same defective envelopes. This was clear evidence that all the envelopes belonged to the same batch of goods. Despite the collected evidence, one important question remained. It had been easy for Louis to poison his wife Diana the first time when she drank the spoiled whiskey, but how had he gotten into the Transamerica office? The branch was located in a new office park with good security. The building was locked on weekends, and access was only possible with a key card. Security system records showed that Diana Harry's key card had been used on March 22nd at 10:18 a.m. This happened on Saturday, the day before Julia Williams' death. It turned out that contractors had been working in one of the units that same day. No one had seen a woman entering the complex, but one of the workers had noticed a man waiting outside to be led onto the construction site. The man had appeared at exactly the time when Diana's card was being used. The worker could not identify Louis from photographs, but he described his car, a blue sports car with a tennis racket in the rear window. After comparing all the evidence, the investigators concluded that Louis Harry Jr. had entered Diana's office using a stolen key card. In January 1986, he had met Verbinia Wooten at a club, and they had begun an affair. Louis had lied to his mistress and said that his relationship with his wife was on the verge of divorce, although he had not originally planned to leave Diana. He was unhappy in his marriage, but Diana earned more and thereby provided them with a decent standard of living. Louis's scheme worked until Verbinia's crazy ex-boyfriend, Roy Fitzpatrick, learned about the affair and began blackmailing Harry with threatening letters. Although most people would have considered this a bad act, Louis saw an opportunity to get everything he wanted, to send his tiresome wife to the other world and frame Roy so that he could then calmly start a new life with Verbinia. To achieve the result, Louis typed several threatening letters on a typewriter and sent them to himself, presenting everything as if Roy was the author. At the same time, he purchased a large amount of potassium cyanide under a fictitious name, believing that he could not be traced. On March 21st, Louis poisoned a bottle of whiskey at home, which contained the poison, knowing that Diana would definitely pour herself a glass to relax. However, everything did not go according to plan. The woman took a small sip and immediately sensed something was wrong. Her husband deliberately kept the bottle of alcohol so that he could later blame Roy. And so that his wife would not suspect anything, he also took a sip of the whiskey, but tried not to swallow a single drop. While Diana was outside recovering from the effects of the cyanide, Lewis was in the bathroom, vigorously rinsing his mouth with water and brushing his teeth to protect himself. The next morning, when Diana still felt ill, the man took advantage of her poor condition and stole the office key card. Arriving at the building, he used the key to get inside the branch itself and poisoned the water in the cooler. Lewis did not want his wife to get off with a light scare again, so he poured cyanide not only into the water, but also into other products in the refrigerator, perfectly understanding that several innocent people could be harmed. When once again, everything did not go as Lewis had planned, and Diana survived a second attempt on her life, he had to do everything possible to pin the crime on Roy Fitzpatrick. But why didn't Lewis simply get a divorce if he wanted to be with Verbinia? The authorities suggested that the crime was at least partly related to money. Diana Harry had life insurance policies for $75,000 and $32,000, as well as an additional $5,000 in company stock. If she had died, all that money would have gone to Lewis. It should not be forgotten that this was 1986, so the sum of $112,000 was not small. It was quite enough to start a new life with his mistress. After all the evidence came together, Lewis Harry was arrested and charged with first-degree felony crime. The most surprising thing was that after his arrest, the man ironically stated that he had been framed and that he was actually innocent. And both women, Diana and Verbinia, believed him, staying with Lewis even after the details of the police investigation became known. Diana not only paid for her husband's legal defense until she ran out of money, but also published a nearly half-page article in the Arizona Republic newspaper in which she outlined all the reasons why she considered her husband innocent. When the case went to trial in the fall of 1986, Diana and Verbinia, sitting next to each other, testified in Lewis's defense. They stated that they did not believe in his guilt and considered Roy Fitzpatrick to be the real criminal. This statement sounded even more shocking considering that Lewis himself admitted in court that he had regularly cheated on Diana. During their 3-year marriage, this was not his first affair on the side. But unfortunately for Lewis, although he may have managed to fool his 2 women, he failed to justify himself before the judge. The evidence against him continued to accumulate. Investigators found his fingerprints on several poisoned items in the Transamerica office. And during the search of Diana's house, they discovered 2 cigar tubes filled with potassium cyanide. In addition, Lewis's colleague, Robert Telenik, gave incriminating testimony. Robert worked as a lab technician at South Mountain Community College. He said that about 3 weeks before the poisonings, Harry Jr. had asked him for information about cyanide. He inquired where it could be bought and how much poison was needed to kill a person. Lewis himself claimed that the information was needed for his friend, who was investigating the Tylenol poisonings in Chicago. At the trial, Lewis continued to stick to his version, claiming that everything had been set up against him and that there were reasonable explanations for each of the charges. For example, he stated that his fingerprints ended up in Diana's office because she had called him that morning, complaining about the strange smell, and he had come to her workplace to figure it out. Although Diana had indeed called Lewis, it is hard to imagine that he had been allowed into the office immediately after the tragic incident had occurred there. In the end, the jury rejected his explanations, and Lewis Harry Jr. was found guilty of the death of Julia Williams, guilty of the attempted murder of 2 other office employees who drank water from the cooler, but, fortunately, survived, and also guilty of 2 separate attempts on the life of his own wife. In February 1987, Lewis Harry Jr. was sentenced to life imprisonment and an additional 105 years in prison. This man knew that anyone who drank the poisoned water could die. His cold-blooded and well-thought-out plan testified to monstrous cruelty. Nevertheless, Harry Jr. never admitted his guilt, stating that it was difficult for him to feel remorse for something he had not done. He remained in prison until his death. Lewis died in June 2021 at the age of 68. The saddest thing about this case is not the betrayal and not the lies, although that is terrible. What is most striking is that the story of 46-year-old Julia Williams the real victim of circumstances, gets lost among all this. Her life was destroyed by a man who cared only about his own selfish desires. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.